In 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., handed over the names of every CIA asset working inside the Soviet Union, and triggered the most devastating intelligence catastrophe in American history. Within months, at least 10 of those agents were arrested, and several were executed with a single bullet to the back of the head in the basement of Lefortovo prison in Moscow. But the question that haunted Western intelligence agencies for years was not simply who betrayed them. It was how the KGB had built the kind of machinery that could recruit, train, and run a man like Ames in the first place, and what that machinery looked like from the inside. The KGB did not stumble into its reputation as the most feared intelligence service of the 20th century. It was engineered methodically and over decades through a training apparatus so elaborate and so secretive that even today, more than 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, significant portions of its curriculum remain classified in Russian archives. What is known comes from a patchwork of sources, defectors who fled to the West and submitted to exhaustive debriefings, declassified documents released in fragments after 1991, and the memoirs of former officers who chose, for various reasons, to talk. When you piece those sources together, a picture emerges of a training system that was simultaneously brutal, psychologically sophisticated, and far ahead of its time. Some of its methods were adopted, quietly and without credit, by Western intelligence agencies. Others remain disturbing even by modern standards. To understand how the KGB trained its spies, you first need to understand who they selected. The pipeline began not with recruitment posters or career fairs, but with observation. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, maintained a network of talent spotters embedded in Soviet universities, particularly the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, known by its Russian acronym MGIMO, and the Maurice Thorez Institute of Foreign Languages. These were elite institutions, and admission alone required a background check that extended to 3 generations of a candidate's family. Students with the right profile, ideological reliability, linguistic talent, psychological resilience, and crucially the right social background were identified as early as their second year. They were never told they were being watched. A professor might casually mention a student's name to a visiting lecturer who happened to hold a KGB commission. A dossier would be opened. The process was invisible and patient. If you've been watching this channel, you know that patience was the defining characteristic of Soviet intelligence. If you're new here and you want to understand how the Cold War was really fought, not in missile silos but in the minds of individuals, then subscribing to this channel is the best way to keep uncovering these stories. Once a candidate was identified, the approach was made carefully and in stages. A KGB officer, often posing as a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, would invite the student for what appeared to be a routine interview about potential diplomatic postings abroad. The conversation would be friendly, probing, and deliberately ambiguous. Only if the student responded well, showing discretion, composure, and a willingness to serve the state without asking too many questions, would the true nature of the opportunity be revealed. Even then, the language was euphemistic. The student was told they had been selected for special work in the service of the motherland. Refusal was technically possible but practically unthinkable. In a society where the KGB's reach extended into every institution, declining such an invitation could mark a person for life. Most candidates accepted, and with that acceptance they entered a world that existed on no official map. The primary training facility for KGB intelligence officers was located just outside Moscow, in a compound that went by several names over the decades, but was most commonly known internally as the Red Banner Institute, officially designated as KGB Higher School No. 101. Later, it was reorganized and renamed the Yuri Andropov Red Banner Institute, after the former KGB chairman who went on to lead the Soviet Union. The facility was hidden in a wooded area, surrounded by fences and guarded checkpoints, and from the outside it could have been mistaken for a military sanitarium or a government dacha complex. Inside, however, it was something else entirely, a fully functioning espionage university, complete with classrooms, laboratories, surveillance training areas, and simulated environments designed to replicate foreign cities. Trainees who entered were given cover identities from day one. They were forbidden from using their real names, even with each other. This was not merely a security precaution. It was the first lesson in operational discipline, the understanding that identity itself was a tool, something to be constructed, maintained, and discarded as the mission required. The curriculum at the Red Banner Institute was divided into two broad tracks. The first was theoretical and covered subjects that might not seem immediately relevant to espionage, but were considered foundational. Trainees studied Marxist-Leninist philosophy, not as abstract ideology, but as a framework for understanding the vulnerabilities of capitalist societies. They studied economics, focusing on the structural weaknesses of Western financial systems. They studied history, particularly the history of intelligence operations, analyzing both Soviet successes and failures with a rigor that would be familiar to any graduate seminar. Oleg Kalugin, who rose to become one of the youngest generals in KGB history before defecting ideologically in the late Soviet period, later described this phase of training as intellectually intense but deliberately disorienting. Trainees were encouraged to question everything about the West while never questioning anything about the Soviet system. The contradiction was the point. It produced officers who could think critically about foreign targets while remaining ideologically obedient at home. The second track was operational, and this is where the training became genuinely remarkable. Trainees learned the craft of espionage, known in Russian as konspiratsia, through a combination of classroom instruction and practical exercises that escalated in complexity over the course of 1 to 3 years, depending on the trainee's designated role. The basics came first: dead drops, brush passes, signal sites, surveillance detection routes. These are the elementary mechanics of clandestine communication. The methods by which a spy passes information or receives instructions without direct contact with a handler. Every intelligence service teaches these skills in some form. What set the KGB's training apart was the intensity and realism of the exercises. Trainees were sent into the streets of Moscow itself, tasked with executing mock operations under the watch of real KGB surveillance teams. These were not friendly evaluations. The surveillance teams were instructed to treat the exercise as if the trainee were an actual foreign agent. If the trainee was detected, the exercise was failed, and the failure was entered into a permanent record that would follow the officer for the rest of their career. Here is a detail that often surprises people. The KGB invested enormous resources in teaching its officers not just how to spy, but how to be someone else entirely. The concept was called legend building, and it went far beyond simply memorizing a cover story. A KGB illegal, an officer deployed abroad under a false identity without diplomatic cover, might spend years constructing and inhabiting a fabricated life before ever conducting a single intelligence operation. Consider the case of Konon Melody, who operated in Britain throughout the late 1950s under the identity of a dead Canadian named Gordon Lonsdale. Melody did not simply carry Lonsdale's passport. He became Lonsdale. He learned to speak English with a Canadian accent, so convincing that native speakers never questioned it. He built a business selling jukeboxes and vending machines. He cultivated friendships, attended parties, dated women. He was charming, gregarious, and utterly false, and none of his associates suspected a thing until his arrest in 1961 as part of the Portland spy ring. The training that produced a man like Melody was not a crash course. It was a years-long immersion in deception as a way of life. At the Red Banner Institute and its associated facilities, legend building was taught as both an art and a science. Trainees destined for illegal assignments underwent what was essentially a complete identity reconstruction. They studied the country they would be infiltrating with obsessive granularity, not just its language, but its regional dialects, its slang, its table manners, its sports, its television programs, its brand names. They learned how to open a bank account, file a tax return, and navigate a foreign bureaucracy without arousing suspicion. They practiced small talk, the kind of meaningless social conversation that is paradoxically the hardest thing for a foreign operative to master because it relies on a deep, unconscious familiarity with cultural norms. KGB trainers understood something that many Western intelligence agencies were slower to grasp, that the most dangerous moment for a spy is not the clandestine meeting or the document exchange, but the casual interaction with a neighbor, a shopkeeper, or a customs official who notices something slightly off about the way a person holds a fork or pronounces a vowel. The psychological dimension of training was equally rigorous, and in some respects more unsettling. The KGB understood that the greatest asset in intelligence work is not technology or tradecraft, but the ability to manipulate human beings. The formal term for this was agent recruitment and handling. But what it really meant was the systematic study of how to identify a person's vulnerabilities, exploit them, and bind that person to you through a combination of ideology, greed, blackmail, or emotional dependency. Trainees studied psychology as a practical discipline. They learned to categorize potential recruits according to motivation. The acronym MICE, standing for money, ideology, compromise, and ego, is often attributed to Western intelligence, but the underlying concepts were taught at the Red Banner Institute long before they became standard Western terminology. Role-playing exercises were a central feature. Trainees would take turns playing the recruiter and the target, working through realistic scenarios in which they had to identify the target's pressure points and construct a pitch tailored to that individual's specific psychology. The exercises were critiqued in detail afterward, and the critiques could be savage. Officers who showed empathy for the target were not necessarily penalized. Empathy was useful because it allowed you to predict behavior, but officers who allowed empathy to compromise the mission were regarded as liabilities. One of the most striking aspects of KGB training was the attention paid to what might be called operational patience. Western intelligence services, particularly the CIA during the early Cold War, often operated under pressure to produce results quickly, to recruit sources, collect intelligence, and justify budgets in the short term. The KGB took a fundamentally different approach. Officers were taught that a recruitment operation might take years. The initial contact with a potential agent could be nothing more than a seemingly accidental meeting at a conference, a friendly conversation at a bar, or a professional introduction through a mutual acquaintance. The KGB officer's job at this stage was simply to establish rapport, to become a trusted friend, and to wait. Only after the relationship had matured, sometimes over the course of 3 or 4 years, would the officer begin to steer conversations towards sensitive topics, testing the target's willingness to share information. And only when the officer was confident that the target was psychologically ready would the formal recruitment pitch be made. This patience was not natural. It was trained into officers through a curriculum that explicitly rewarded long-term thinking and penalized impulsiveness. The training did not end at the gates of the Red Banner Institute. Once deployed, KGB officers were subject to ongoing evaluation and continuing education that persisted throughout their careers. Residenturas, the KGB stations operating under diplomatic cover in foreign capitals, functioned as both operational headquarters and, in a sense, advanced training environments. Junior officers were mentored by senior colleagues and expected to refine their skills in the field under real conditions. Mistakes were tolerated to a degree, but repeated failures triggered a review process that could result in reassignment to less prestigious postings, effectively ending an officer's career in foreign intelligence. The institutional culture was one of controlled fear. Officers were motivated by a combination of patriotic duty, career ambition, and the ever-present awareness that the system they served was perfectly capable of turning on them. There is a dimension of KGB training that is often overlooked in popular accounts, and it deserves attention here because it reveals something fundamental about how the Soviet intelligence apparatus functioned. This is the training of agents, as distinct from officers. A KGB officer was a Soviet citizen, a career professional employed by the state. An agent was a foreigner who had been recruited to spy on behalf of the Soviet Union. The handling of agents was considered the most sensitive and most prestigious area of KGB work, and the training for it was correspondingly intense. Officers who were designated as agent handlers, known in Russian as operativniki, underwent specialized instruction in what amounted to applied social engineering. They learned to manage not just the information flow from an agent, but the agent's emotional state, personal life, and sense of loyalty. A well-handled agent was one who felt not coerced, but valued, not trapped, but committed. The KGB's most successful recruitments, men like Kim Philby, who spied for Moscow for decades out of genuine ideological conviction, or Aldrich Ames, who was motivated primarily by money, but was managed with remarkable skill, were products of this training philosophy. The case of Kim Philby is worth pausing on, because it illustrates both the strengths and the peculiarities of the KGB's approach. Philby was recruited in 1934, long before the KGB existed in its later form, by a Soviet intelligence officer named Arnold Deutsch. Deutsch was himself a product of a training tradition that emphasized intellectual sophistication and ideological persuasion over brute coercion. He approached Philby not as a spy to be blackmailed, but as an idealist to be cultivated. The The recruitment was framed as a partnership between equals in a shared cause, the global struggle against fascism and capitalism. This framing was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate strategy, developed and refined over years, that recognized the power of ideology as a recruitment tool, particularly among young, idealistic members of the Western elite who were disillusioned with their own governments. The Cambridge Five, Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, were all recruited through variations of this approach, and their collective intelligence output was staggering. For nearly 2 decades, the Soviet Union had access to some of the most closely guarded secrets of the British and American governments, courtesy of agents who believed they were fighting for a better world. But the KGB's training system also had a darker side, and it would be dishonest to omit it. The institution that trained its officers in the subtleties of psychological manipulation was the same institution that ran an extensive program of what it called active measures, disinformation campaigns, political subversion, and, when deemed necessary, assassination. Officers assigned to Department V, later reorganized as Directorate S's Special Operations Component, received training in what were euphemistically called special tasks. This included the use of poisons, a field in which the KGB invested considerable scientific resources, the assassination of Ukrainian nationalist leader Stepan Bandera in Munich in 1959, carried out by KGB officer Bogdan Stashinsky using a specially designed poison spray gun, was the product of this training pipeline. Stashinsky later defected to the West and provided detailed testimony about his preparation, which included extensive rehearsal of the assassination method, psychological conditioning to overcome the natural human aversion to killing, and meticulous planning of escape routes. His account, corroborated by forensic evidence, offered one of the most detailed windows ever opened into this aspect of KGB training. The physical and technical dimensions of training should not be understated either. KGB officers received instruction in photography, including the use of miniature cameras designed to photograph documents quickly and discreetly. They learned radio communications, including Morse code and the use of one-time pads for encoding messages. They were trained in the detection and use of electronic surveillance equipment, bugs, wiretaps, and later, more sophisticated listening devices. The KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for communications intelligence, operated its own training facilities where officers learned to intercept, decode, and analyze foreign communications. And throughout all of this, there was a relentless emphasis on security, on protecting one's own communications, one's own identity, and one's own network from penetration by the adversary. The KGB's counterintelligence training was, by many accounts, the most paranoid and the most effective in the world. Officers were taught to assume that they were always under surveillance, that every colleague was a potential informant, and that every success could be the prelude to a trap. This culture of suspicion was exhausting, but it produced operators who were extraordinarily difficult to catch. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not erase this training tradition, it transformed it. Many former KGB officers transitioned into the successor agencies, the SVR for foreign intelligence, the FSB for domestic security, and brought their training and institutional memory with them. Others moved into the private sector, applying their skills to corporate espionage, organized crime, or political consulting. The techniques taught at the Red Banner Institute, psychological profiling, legend construction, patient recruitment, information warfare, did not become obsolete. They adapted. When Russian intelligence officers were expelled from Western countries in waves during the 2010s and 2020s, the operations they were caught conducting bore unmistakable hallmarks of the same tradecraft that had been taught in that wooded compound outside Moscow decades earlier. The attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, England, in 2018, using a nerve agent from the Novichok family, was carried out by officers from GRU military intelligence rather than the SVR. But the operational philosophy, the willingness to use poison as a tool of state policy, the meticulous planning, the layers of cover identity, traced a direct lineage back to the KGB's training doctrine. What makes the KGB's training system historically significant is not merely its effectiveness, but what it reveals about the nature of intelligence work itself. The KGB understood, perhaps more clearly than any organization before or since, that espionage is fundamentally a human enterprise. Technology matters. Satellites, code-breaking machines, electronic intercepts, all of these contributed to the intelligence picture. But the decisive advantage, the thing that no technology could replicate, was the ability to persuade another human being to betray their country, their colleagues, and their conscience. That ability could not be mass-produced. It had to be cultivated, one officer at a time, through a training process that was part education, part indoctrination, and part psychological transformation. The men and women who emerged from that process were not ordinary bureaucrats. They were, in a very real sense, professional manipulators, people who had been trained to see every human interaction as an opportunity and every relationship as a potential operation. There is an irony embedded in this history that is worth noting as we close. The KGB's training system was designed to serve a state that claimed to be building a society based on transparency, equality, and collective trust. Yet the system itself was built on secrecy, hierarchy, and the systematic exploitation of individual weakness. The officers it produced were taught to weaponize the very human qualities, trust, friendship, idealism, loneliness, that the Soviet state claimed to champion. This contradiction was not lost on everyone who passed through the system. Some, like Oleg Gordievsky, who served as a senior KGB officer while secretly working for British intelligence from 1974 to 1985, came to see the hypocrisy as intolerable and chose to fight it from within. Others, like Vladimir Putin, who trained at the Red Banner Institute and served as a KGB officer in Dresden, East Germany, during the 1980s, absorbed the system's lessons and carried them forward into a new era of Russian statecraft. The training did not end when the institution changed its name. It did not end when the Berlin Wall fell or when the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The skills, the methods, the mindset, these things endure, because they are rooted not in any particular ideology, but in a timeless understanding of how power works, how secrets move, and how human beings can be bent, broken, or turned to serve purposes they never imagined. The KGB knew this. They built an entire system around it. And the shadow of that system stretches further into the present than most people are comfortable admitting.